Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Part 1. Many, if not most, thinkers command our admiration and respect, even if we don't always find ourselves in agreement with them. Some few, however, do not. Of all the thinkers we have encountered and shall encounter who have written on political philosophy, there can be little doubt that Jean-Jacques Rousseau will stake a claim to be one of the least likeable. If you had to choose someone to go for a companionable drink with, Rousseau would not be your first choice. If he had ever been found suffering from a gunshot wound, the question, who shot J.J. Orr, would have elicited a long list of possible suspects. Rousseau is a figure whom many people love to hate, and there is good reason for this. He was self-centered, vain, self-pitying, narcissistic, and he yoked all these unattractive traits to an irrepressible lust for self-publicity. An angry young man before his time, he made the common mistake of confusing rudeness and boorishness with honesty and integrity, betraying a bumptiousness that probably resulted from knowing that he could never hope to move by right in the highest social circles to which he aspired. He had the Mrs. Jellyby-like liberal vice of loving, or claiming to love, all mankind, while showing a particular propensity for hating individuals. He was a notorious ingrate, falling out with those who had made the fatal error of being kind and helpful to him, including Voltaire, Diderot, Tronchat, and that most personally lovable of all philosophers, David Hume. J.S. McClelland remarks that Hume tried to be decent to Rousseau in his English exile, but the meeting between reasoned moderation and paranoid romanticism ended in disaster. His personal life was irregular, to say the least, an irregularity revealed with much pseudo-moralizing in his confessions. While we might, in the ethically relaxed 21st century, be inclined to overlook much in Rousseau's life that scandalized his contemporaries, his callous abandonment of the 5 children he had with Thérèse Levasseur still has the capacity to shock. Perhaps even more shocking is the patently specious justification Rousseau offered for the abandonment of his children. He claimed that they would be better provided for in every way in the orphanage, a claim that is patently less than plausible when Rousseau must have been well aware that roughly 2/3 of the babies deposited in the Hôpital des Enfants Trouvés died within the first year. Some might argue that Rousseau's personal failings are irrelevant to a consideration of his ideas, but Paul Johnson believes that it is right to dwell on his desertion of his children, not only because it is the most striking single example of his humanity, but because it is organically part of the process which produced his theory of politics and the role of the state. Education was the key to social and moral improvement, and therefore education is and should be a concern of the state, thought Rousseau. In Rousseau's vision, the state becomes father to all, and citizens are all children in the state orphanage. It is not only in respect of his having written a Confessions that Rousseau resembles Augustine. The thinking of both men is, to an extraordinary degree, an exteriorization of their character and personal circumstances. In addition, both men were consumed by the discrepancy between what they aspired to be and what they were. That said, what they wrote could hardly be more different. All that Rousseau wrote on philosophy and politics, notes Sabine, grew in some devious way from his complex and unhappy personality. If the medieval period had been an attempt to come to grips with our world by means of reason and revelation, the early modern period kept the reason and ditched revelation. In fact, if not expressly. Rousseau's Romanticism ditched both revelation and reason, seeking its home in sentiment and feeling. Given the highly peculiar circumstances of his life, as recounted in his admittedly unreliable Confessions, and the widely acknowledged problems of interpreting certain aspects of his thought, it is tempting to dismiss Rousseau out of hand as a thinker unworthy of serious consideration. To do so, however, would be a major error. Whatever his personal failings, his influence cannot be denied. Perhaps more than any modern thinker, Rousseau has determined the agenda for all modern and contemporary discussions of political philosophy. Rousseau, writes Viktor Gurevich, has permanently altered how we perceive ourselves, one another, and the world about us, and in particular how we conceive of politics and what we expect of it. Paul Johnson also testifies to the influence of Rousseau, writing that he was the first of the modern intellectuals, their archetype, and in many ways the most influential of them all. In both the long and short term, his influence was enormous. Among Rousseau's admirers and followers, we can find an impressive and diverse range of thinkers and political activists: Robespierre, Kant, Hegel, Schiller, Shelley, Mill, Marx, Levi-Strauss, Foucault, and Derrida. He has contributed to, or has been believed to have contributed to, not one but two revolutions, the American and the French, and to have affected not one but several schools of thought, among them Kantianism, German idealism, directly and also via Kant, the Romantic movement and its progeny, including Nietzsche, 20th century totalitarianism, and perhaps most surprisingly, modern conservatism and communitarianism. Rousseau achieved overnight fame as a result of the publication of his first discourse, an outcome that Johnson finds frankly astonishing. He writes, "The essay is feeble and today almost unreadable. It seems inexplicable that so paltry a work could have produced such an explosion of celebrity." Rousseau's later philosophical work, the Second Discourse and the Social Contract, were in fact little read during Rousseau's lifetime. His continuing and expanding fame after the production of the First Discourse was due largely to his novel La Nouvelle Héloïse, and to a lesser extent to his treatise on education, the didactic novel Émile. Émile is the source text for the progressive movement in education, influencing such as Pestalozzi and Montessori and others. Héloïse, like the First Discourse, is scarcely readable today, but in its day it had an appeal to the prurient, cleverly concealed under a mask of morality. The Archbishop of Paris accusing it of insinuating the poison of lust while seeming to prescribe it, an accusation which of course did nothing to inhibit its sales. Rousseau's First Discourse, the Discourse on the Sciences and Arts, was written as an entry to a competition organised by the Dijon Academy on the topic. Has the restoration of the sciences and the arts contributed to the purification of morals? There can be little doubt that the Academy expected contributors to answer yes to this question, and then go on to describe how the arts and sciences had made this contribution. Rousseau, however, took the startling and counterintuitive step of answering the question in the negative. Far from its being the case that science and culture have improved a man's moral life, they have, on the contrary, caused it to deteriorate. His First Discourse is an attack on reason, on science, and by implication, on the whole Enlightenment project. In their place, Rousseau sets sentiment, even instinct, and a natural and unspoiled reverence. Those who are simple and thoughtless are to be valued more than the sophisticated and the educated. All Rousseau's moral valuations, writes Sabine, turned upon the affections of family life, the joy and beauty of motherhood, the satisfactions of the homely arts like tilling the soil, the universal feeling of religious reverence, above all, the sense of a common lot and the sharing of a common life. By contrast, science is the fruit of idle curiosity. Philosophy is mere intellectual frippery. The amenities of polite life are tinsel. This First Discourse, together with the Second Discourse, is the source of the commonly held idea that Rousseau expounds the theory of the nobility of the savage and recommends a return to man's naive simplicity. This idea is not quite accurate. For one thing, whatever the shortcomings of cultured society, Rousseau never thought that a return to primitive simplicity was in fact possible. All of Rousseau's central ideas are in essence a transmutation and projection of his own particular life and circumstances into the life and circumstances of all, so that his hero isn't the noble savage, but himself writ large, an irritated and bewildered bourgeois, at odds with the society that despised and looked down on him, conscious of his own purity of heart and the greatness of his own deserts, and profoundly shocked at the badness of the philosophers to whom nothing was sacred. The romantic in Rousseau opposes feeling to intellect, tradition to enlightenment, and faith to science. George Sabine writes, "The enormous importance of Rousseau lies in the fact that, broadly speaking, he carried philosophy with him against its own tradition. The distrust of intelligence was written large over the philosophy of the 19th century. It might be more true to say that Rousseau's attitude towards reason was one of ambivalence rather than outright rejection. As he saw it, reason was rather like the broom enchanted by the sorcerer's apprentice, that once unleashed couldn't be restrained or controlled. So too, reason was to be encouraged and welcomed when it attacked and destroyed obvious excrescences such as the church, but not when, like the animated broom, it went on a rampage and threatened to destroy all that was valuable in human life." Rousseau first made vocal a newly awakened fear, writes Sabine, the fear that rational criticism, having demolished the more inconvenient pieties like the dogmas and disciplines of the Church, might not be made to stop before the pieties which it still seemed judicious to retain. A century later, we can see a similar ambivalence in the attitude of Friedrich Nietzsche. What Rousseau was driving at was the idea that what society needed to improve its morals was not heavier doses of science, technology, or philosophy, but a re-education of the passions. Moral political excellence can only be achieved by everyone's recognizing the shared concern for the common interest or good as the organizing principle of their cares and pursuits, writes Gurevich. In our civilized society, there appears to be an ineradicable tension between the good of the individual and the common good. It seems that good of any individual can only be achieved at the expense of the good of all. If this is so, why, Rousseau asks, is it so? Is there something the matter with human beings so that this tension is irremovable? Or does the problem lie elsewhere? In the second discourse on the origin and foundations of inequality among men, Rousseau attempts to answer this question. He distinguishes between what he calls physical inequality, all aspects of our physical and psychological being, and what he calls moral inequality, by which he means the difference between being ruled and being a ruler. He is concerned primarily with moral inequality. Rousseau adopts Hobbes's term, state of nature, to describe man's pre-political condition, but his account of the state of nature is very different from that given by Hobbes. In fact, he thinks Hobbes got matters precisely the wrong way around by not being sufficiently radical in his account of natural man, and imagining him to have desires that can only arise in society. According to Rousseau, Hobbes should have said that the state of nature is the state in which the care for our own preservation is least prejudicial to the self-preservation of others. It follows that this state was the most conducive to peace and that the best suited to mankind. He said precisely the contrary because he improperly included in savage man's care for his preservation the need to satisfy a multitude of passions that are the product of society and have made laws necessary. Rousseau accepts that man in the state of nature is gifted with a desire for self-preservation. He calls this self-love, but he sees this as being balanced by an equally native propensity to feel pity for others. Pity, he writes, is a disposition to beings as weak and as subject to so many ills as we are, a virtue all the more universal and useful to man, as it precedes the exercise of all reflection in him. If man had needed the assistance of moral philosophy to survive, he would have perished forthwith. The state of nature, then, is not a war of all against all. Otherwise, how would Hobbes explain the survival of man prior to his entry into civil society? While Socrates and minds of his stamp may be able to acquire virtue through reason, mankind would long ago have ceased to be if its preservation had depended solely on the reasons of those who make it up. It is widely believed that Rousseau's central contention is that man in a state of nature is naturally good. Well, yes, but this is not quite the whole story. In the state of nature, man is not good in the way that someone is good who can choose evil but doesn't, but rather good in the way that an entity which has not yet eaten of the tree of good and evil can be said to be good. This is a kind of natural goodness rather than a moral goodness. Pre-social man is pre-moral and largely pre-rational as well. Just as an animal, however ferocious it may be, is not a fit subject for moral evaluation, so too is man in the state of nature. In the state of nature, writes Gurevich, man's natural goodness is perfectly compatible with fierceness, even with ferociousness, cruelty, and a considerable level of violence. Natural goodness is then emphatically not beneficence, the inclination or the steady will to do another's good, nor is it virtue, let alone the justice that consists in doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. Nothing in Rousseau's account of men in the pre-political state of nature justifies calling them noble savages. In asserting that man is naturally good and that society is responsible for his deformation, Rousseau has taken to reject the Christian notion of original sin. But Rousseau's own story is in many respects simply a secular version of the Christian story. Rousseau's state of nature is the Christian Garden of Eden. Rousseau's pre-social man is not so much naturally good as naturally outside the scope of good and evil. In the Christian story, it is not until Adam and Eve eat of the fruit of the tree of good and evil that they move from their state of original innocence to a state of moral awareness. The Christian's original sin is Rousseau's advent of civilization with its property and its government. Adam and Eve and their descendants are expelled from Eden, never to return, while Rousseau's man in society now finds himself prey to vanity, self-seeking and conflict. It's not until man discovers agriculture that society becomes possible, and with it moral awareness and moral freedom, and with them the necessity for government and the domination of one man by another. In the Christian story, after the fall, man must earn his bread by the sweat of his brow, and the children of Adam are tillers of the soil and pastoralists. In Rousseau's fable, civilized man is prey to many evils simply unknown to man in the state of nature. Rousseau did not believe, contra people such as Samuel Pufendorf and many others, that men were naturally social beings, nor did he believe, contra Hobbes, that men were naturally antagonistic. For Rousseau, man in the state of nature is neither social nor antisocial, neither moral nor immoral. He is rather asocial and amoral. Men in this condition are not and cannot be either just or unjust. He writes, "Let us not conclude with Hobbes that because he had no idea of goodness, man is naturally wicked, that he is vicious because he does not know virtue, that he always refuses to those his kind services which he does not believe he owes them, or that by virtue of the right which he reasonably claims to the things he needs, he insanely imagines himself to be the sole owner of the entire universe." Part of Rousseau's criticism of Locke and Hobbes is that their state of nature simply didn't go far enough. To get to a state of nature, you have to strip off everything that society contributes to man, including language, reason, and sociability. Natural man is neither moral nor immoral, he is rather pre-moral. He is an animal without thought, operating purely on instinct. Rousseau's men in the state of nature have taken away from them not only the accoutrements of developed Western civilization, but almost everything that makes them human: morality, language, and rationality. Rousseau's original man, without thought, without language, is scarcely recognizable as human, resembling rather an amiable chimpanzee. This anthropology is often taken to be unique to Rousseau, but it has antecedents, generally among the Stoics, and more immediately in the accounts of early man one can find expressed by George Buchanan and Juan de Mariana. In the state of nature, man has two guiding principles: self-preservation and pity or sympathy. These two principles provide a kind of balance, each preventing the other from being exercised to excess. Neither of these principles is calculating or the product of reason. They are pre-rational. In their natural state, men have the potential to be free, something given to no other animal. This potential is actualized only when man's circumstances change radically. It is only in society that men become self-seeking and egoistic, desiring things not because of their intrinsic worth, but because they want to excite the admiration of others. What snake is it then that introduces sin into this relatively Edenic state? Agriculture, with property as its inexorable accompaniment. Originally, hunting and herding sufficed for men's needs, with relatively little effort. Agriculture, however, arises later and involves all the arts. It introduces property, government, laws, and gradually wretchedness and crimes, inseparable for our species from the knowledge of good and evil. Man, once self-sufficient, is self-sufficient no longer. This dependence upon others leads to the division of labour, which, in turn, leads to inequality. For the once insignificant physical differences between man and band now assume a moral character and become inequalities not of strong versus weak or clever versus stupid, but between rich and poor, ruler and ruled, master and slave. While Rousseau has the concept of a state of nature, just as Hobbes and Locke do, his state of nature is not exited by means of a social contract. What's remarkable about Rousseau's account of the origins of human society, writes McClelland, is that although he is a social contract thinker, he does not use the idea of social contract itself to explain the origins of human societies. In fact, he is remarkably coy about explaining why and how the transition from natural man to social man took place. In this no longer innocent condition, conflict now arises. And since those with property have more to lose than those without property, they propose a compact to set up a supreme power that would rule all men in accordance with law and protect the possessions of each. The rich must soon have sensed how disadvantageous to them was a perpetual war of which they alone bore the full cost, and in which everyone risked his life, while only some also risked goods. Rousseau regards the proposal to agree to this compact to be one of the all-time great swindles by which the rich man's adversaries were turned into his defenders. Persuaded that a supreme power would be to their advantage, all ran toward their chains in the belief that they were securing their freedom. For while they had enough reason to sense the advantages of a political establishment, they had not enough experience to foresee its dangers. It is important to realize that this compact does not constitute man as a member of society. He is that already. What it does is to constitute men as members of a political order. Rousseau's description of man, once he has entered society, is uncannily similar to Hobbes' state of nature. In society, humans become self-seeking and egoistic, desiring things not because of their intrinsic worth, but because they want to excite the admiration of others. In comparing ourselves with others, the self is never satisfied, because in valuing ourselves above others, we vainly demand that others value us above themselves. At this point, the capacity for both freedom and self-perfection is undermined. For Rousseau, property is not something that belongs to man in the state of nature. Possession, yes; property, no. The second discourse is notorious for the following passage. Rousseau writes, "The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, to whom it occurred to say, 'This is mine,' and found people sufficiently simple to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. How many crimes, wars, murders, how many miseries and horrors mankind would have been spared by him who, pulling up the stakes or filling in the ditch, had cried out to his kind, 'Beware of listening to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits are everyone's and the earth no one's.'" This passage echoes ideas that came before Rousseau from the Franciscans, from Winstanley, ideas that will be re-echoed later by Henry George and others. Does this put Rousseau in the communist camp? Well, not necessarily. However regrettable it may have been that man ever invented property and human society, the reality is that this is what we have and we just have to get on with it. What Rousseau is really trying to get across in this passage, and in others like it, is that property is not a right that man holds against society, but one that he holds only within society. Property is the source of almost all human ills, certainly the ills of inequality and the vain desire for reputation. Rousseau's account of the origin of property is surprisingly close to that of Locke. The origin of a claim to property lies in the labour that I expend in making use of the earth's resources. With the advent of agriculture and the longer time span required for the use of natural resources, possession necessarily becomes longer and longer, so much so that it leads eventually to a claim of right, that is, to property. This in turn gives rise to conflicts and a war of all against all, from which man, desiring to escape, agrees to the imposition of the legitimate use of power by one man or a group of men over others. What Rousseau wanted to emphasize was that the passions that incline us to violence, aggression, and war are not pre-societal, but actually acquired in society itself. Violence is not an aspect of the condition of man in the state of nature. In particular, war is not in any way an aspect of the life of natural man. For Rousseau, war is the result of a corruption of human nature. It is a condition that prevails among states and not among individuals, and its consequences are far more destructive. Instead of alleviating violence, states accentuate it. Readers have often assumed that Rousseau is proposing a return to our condition of original innocence, and passages such as the following give some grounds for thinking this to be so. He writes, "Savage man and civilized man differ so much in their inmost heart and inclinations that what constitutes the supreme happiness of the one would reduce the other to despair. The first breathes nothing but repose and freedom. He wants only to live and to remain idle, and even the Stoic's ataraxia does not approximate his profound indifference to everything else. By contrast, the citizen, forever active, sweats, scurries, constantly agonizes in search of ever more strenuous occupation. He works to the death, even rushes towards it in order to be in a position to live, or renounces life in order to acquire immortality." But there is no going back. The liberty that men enjoyed in the state of nature is, like my darling Clementine, lost and gone forever. Such liberty as we may find will be a simulacrum of the original, not its reinstallation. The clue to Rousseau's solution to the problem of liberty within a political community, writes McClelland, lies in his assertion that the natural liberty of the state of nature has gone forever. We now live in a social condition from which there is no turning back. The only way lies forward, so that all this hankering after a so-called natural liberty has to stop. Take that, libertarians.